Welcome, class, to our first flipped lesson here for AP World History. This is World War II unit that we are covering right now, and a particular focus on appeasement. And so this will be, what you're watching here is a video, relatively shorter video in length than some of the lectures we already have online. Feel free to pause this video and go back as needed. The point, like I mentioned in class, is that I would like you guys to watch this particular video in terms of the content that I cover, along with the learn the skills about how I'm analyzing certain things, and ultimately those analysis questions that come at the end of this particular lesson. So be prepared to answer those questions by having watched this video and then having those questions answered. So let's begin. The first part of this conversation that we have to have when talking about appeasement into World War II is World War I. And so you can see this image here, sort of one of those many iconic defining images of what World War I was all about. The futility of the war, the devastation to the environment, and to the huge losses of people on both sides, the changing to how people even viewed the world around them. And if you look back at the start of the war, when we talked about how that all began, the sense of after World War I, and with the creation of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, was a huge desire by many in the world to be able to never let this happen again, because the start of World War I it seemed like the war was futile. There was no reasoning behind it all, because the system of alliances, nationalism, and militarism, like we had talked about before, brought about this drastic event. So if we could prevent that from happening in the future, the leaders of Europe felt that this is of their utmost necessity, and that's something to keep in mind about the reasoning why leaders like some of the ones that we're going to talk about were very concerned about not letting this happen. Thus, the reason for appeasement. I have an interesting image. Speaking of World War I, this is images in the city of Munich, and we saw some of these earlier in our discussions about World War I, about the sense of nationalism and pride by all the countries going up into World War I. And so here you have a scene, like I said, in Munich with German citizens excited about the prospects of going to war. And this is a really sort of interesting shot, because as you can see here in the middle of this, and in the zoom-in image right there, that is a young Adolf Hitler. And you can see not necessarily just a picture of him, but the excitement that he has on his face here. Like many people who were very much interested in the prospect of going to war. But now let's fast forward through the war, like we talked about, and what happens afterwards. If we can remember, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles is the official end of the war, and in here the leaders, the big three, like we talked about, each gave up compromises. Wilson for his League of Nations, and the Germans and the French were interested in punishing Germany, giving reparations and so forth. And so we talked about how the Treaty of Versailles is seen as sort of a failure in history. And so I want to be able to keep that in mind as we analyze our first cartoon, our first biblical cartoon here in this appeasement lesson. And so with what we know here about the Treaty of Versailles, what we can see here is this particular document. And this document, life-size, now has Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler is not just crawling out of it, but in many ways he is or coming out of it. You can see sort of emerging or being born out of it. He is the fruits of this. Like I said, this failed document, the Treaty of Versailles. The cartoonist doesn't necessarily does both. Talks about Hitler himself, but also about the party, Hitler Party, the Nazis, of course. And so, in many ways, you can see how the cartoonist is truly sort of giving blame of the Treaty of Versailles. And as we learn about more totalitarian regimes, and I think we talked about this in class, the question often comes up is how places like Russia and Italy, and the greatest example here in post-World War I Germany, how these societies can allow radical extremist groups to come into power. And like we see here, it's because of all of the issues that the Treaty of Versailles had done to Germany. And that, of course, was the huge reparations they had to pay, tying in with that with the worldwide depression and the economic collapse in Germany, and the people in Germany who were looking and truly hoping for a change. And that is really what Adolf Hitler stands for. He did bring about promised change. So speaking of his rise, begins is not like many people would imagine in terms of overthrowing the government, because that's his first original attempt here. And here we can see an early picture of Hitler and other members of the Nazi Party. And what they try to do in 1923, and I have an image here, let me show you. In 1923, still in the city of Munich, they and their sort of fledgling Nazi Party are really playing upon the animosity towards the rest of Europe that Germany feels. And so they decide that in Munich they're going to try to overthrow the local government there and start a revolution. And this sort of is born out of a beer hall, and so it's called often the beer hall push, in which that Hitler and his Nazi party sort of start this revolution. What's interesting about this revolution is that it's a failure in terms of that the leaders are captured, put in jail, and it's here where Hitler actually his time in jail helps take his meteoric rise to power to this point, to the next step, and where he writes his book and starts to gain much more support as Germany continues to flounder. So, looking here, what's his next step? His next step is to do something different from what he had done before, in terms of now what he's trying to do is try to find a legitimate way to power. So not necessarily just him. We can see Hitler here, but up in the top, who he's running with here is a war hero. He's running on an election ticket. These two men, it's going to be Hindenburg and Hitler. And here are posters, election posters, as they're trying to sway public opinion. Vote for, just like we see today in terms of advertisements during elections. These two guys are running for elected office. And Hitler is running as number 2 under Hindenburg. They ultimately will win. And then what happens here is this gives Hitler his opportunity to rise up and become Chancellor of Germany through elected means, which again goes back to that conversation when we want to think about how the Germans allowed this to happen. So, Germany will rapidly begin to change, and in terms of this totalitarian regime here. And so here's a great, I know we don't speak German, but let's look at this ballot here. And without being able to read, but we can definitely see here, and who are we going to vote for in this German election? Is it Adolf Hitler? Question mark. Now look at your two choices. I will translate Ja, which is yes, and Nein, which is no. But just look at the difference of the sizes of your checkbox. Am I clicking Ja or am I clicking Nein? Very much, you can see how the government is more than slightly trying to convince you as a voter about what their expectations for you to do. And so this ultimately brings, like we said, Hitler to power. And what he does create, he creates an extreme form. He ties on this continuing idea of this extreme form of nationalism. And nationalism much larger and much more at the expense of others that we had seen. And so let's do some more translations. We have ein Volk, ein Reich, and ein Führer. And what this ultimately means, if ein will mean one, and so Volk is people, so one people, ein Reich, one empire, and lastly, one Führer. One people, one empire, all led through one Führer. So Hitler starts to take this idea that it's nationalism, but it's also nationalism with me. And we talked about this on We Should Understand It, called the cult of personality. So people start to give that sense of identity, that sense of us as a national, as a people, as a German people, centered around that man. And we'll see this in other places as well. So now let's look at this German expansion map. In this map that we see here, from 1933 to 1939, because 39 is the date when World War II will begin with the German invasion of Poland. But let's backtrack a little bit. And this again goes back to the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations and what ultimately happened to Germany. And so following along here, you can see Germany 1933 is in red. Then they start to remilitarize. And what that means is start to move troops into this area called the Rhineland, which although it was German, they were told that you cannot put any troops there, trying to create a buffer zone between them and France, because of course, remember that Western Front, all quiet on the Western Front. So the Germans were told no moving of troops into the Rhineland. Well, once Hitler decides to do this, what is the reaction going to be? And that's what this lesson today is all about, the reaction of everybody else. What happens is nothing. Okay, he remilitarizes the Rhineland, nothing happens. So now that he has that region, what next is on his plate? After taking that, then you can see he starts to annex or just take. He takes Austria, okay, and then he starts to move into this region. Czechoslovakia is where it's all going to take place here, particularly this western place over here called the Sudetenland. This is where huge numbers of German-speaking people are living, and this is where it all culminates in the Munich agreement. So what happens here is that now we're going to get the British involved. The British have seen this. They've seen this. They're worried about German expansion. So what should be done? Should Hitler be stopped? And it's at this point where, let's fast. Our next image here we see a very critical, and this is a British cartoonist. So like we talked about, what is Britain's role going to be here? Here's some of the political cartoonists of the day talking about what is everybody doing as Hitler is doing these things. So as he's building up this is rearmament. What are they doing? Like it says here, they're doing nothing. They're laying down, these spineless leaders of democracy. What does they do is they build up their fortifications, the Rhineland fortifications. They go into the Rhineland. What happens? Nothing. Danzig, and if I go back out, let me just show you that map here about where Danzig is, starting to move into this region over here, okay, connecting the two parts of Germany. Nothing is done, and it's at this point, fast forward, we're not going to get to this today in this lesson, but this is where ultimately World War II breaks in as the Germans try to reunify the eastern part of Prussia with the invasion of Poland. But let's backtrack a little bit and look a little bit more here. As we see here, Hitler continues to march along, and the cartoonist is very critical as Hitler is doing these high marching called a goose step, and ultimately what we see here is that he is moving to become boss of the universe, or ultimately become a dictator, the empire builder here in Europe. And he is thumbing his nose at all of, not necessarily just the leaders of democracy, but of in Europe, but of everywhere through the whole world, that he is very, very obvious about his intentions, but nobody's willing to do anything about it. Now, let's look about who is, of all these people that are most critical of, and it's this individual. His name is Neville Chamberlain. He is the Prime Minister of Britain at the time. Now, Neville Chamberlain is very concerned because of his memories of World War I. So looking here at this quote here, how horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Why is he not that concerned about Czechoslovakia? Because he has memories of going to war over something that happened in Sarajevo with the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So his issues are that of getting into a conflict for no reason. And so this fear, if you would, and this has been a highly criticized, his decision here by people for ever since for the past 70 years, of his decision of not getting involved. So he decides what's the reasoning for it, and now let's take a look at another cartoon of the day that shows and is critical of this. So we can tell by the look here that who is this individual right here? This is Neville Chamberlain, and he is trying to deal with Hitler's going through taking parts of Czechoslovakia. Hitler was taking Czechoslovakia, like we said, for those German-speaking people, and the term is Anschluss. He says, well, I must unify German people, this extreme form of nationalism. Now, all Neville Chamberlain is not concerned about Britain, but he's concerned about worldwide, the world, and trying to manage the world into a peaceful situation, even though they're in some troubling times that could lead to war. The cartoonist in here is very critical that it looks like this ball is not going to make it because it's cracking. He's leaving, it's hard to read here, but that says chaos. So in the end, what do you think? Is this cartoonist saying that Chamberlain is going to be successful in terms of getting this ball across, or is it going to give? And you can kind of see it leaves it a little bit hard to tell, but not so with future. Case in point, this one. What is the reason for Hitler for doing this? And why does Chamberlain give? And ultimately, what does Chamberlain get in return? One, the idea that he does not want to go to war in Czechoslovakia, and with the hope, like the cartoonist is saying here in this one, here's Hitler doing that goose step, and he's doing what's called this proverbial line in the sand, and that's why he puts it at a beach here. A line in the sand alludes to the idea that this line can get washed away or scratched away, and a new line put up, and another line, because you just keep taking more, and nothing's going to stop me from doing this. So here it says, this is my last territorial demand in Europe. And the cartoonist is saying sort of, yeah, right. Now let's listen to the words of Chamberlain himself and how he felt after his return from Munich. He goes and visits Hitler, and they make a decision, interesting, back in the city of Munich again, and he really demands and wants Hitler to promise him that if he does get Czechoslovakia, like that line in the sand, will you please promise never to invade anybody else? So let's hear what Chamberlain has to say.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
So interesting in looking at this, it's not necessarily just him. His belief that Hitler was not, that he was an honest man and he was not lying to him. He'd signed that piece of paper. Looking at it through a modern lens, the modern context, we would think that, boy, it's Hitler, and of course he's lying to you. You give him Czechoslovakia and he's going to only want more. But at the time, you can see how much even the crowd around him was excited about this idea that here you have the leader, the elected leader of Germany, who's promising not to do anything more. And this idea that it's just about nationalism, it's only about German-speaking people. And that's going to lead us up to our, and that question is here. So our first analysis question, why do you think that when Neville Chamberlain struck the Munich Agreement with Hitler, he was widely hailed as the savior of Europe? Not just was he the savior of Europe, but the idea of widely hailed, how it was the view of those around him who felt that he was doing what was in the best interest. This question is going to be the first one that we're going to go over. So here for our second analysis prompt that I want you to do here is your first political cartoon. This is a contemporary cartoon of the Munich Agreement, and of course you can see here, right here we have Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia, I'll just give you a couple points here. He is the patient. I really want to be able to have some conversations about his expression. So let's think about some good vocabulary words we can use to describe how he's feeling, why he's feeling a certain way. Notice where he's going, and then the individuals over here. We know, of course, Germany, but let's have some conversations about all the other players, along with what they're doing and the whole intent behind the whole thing. Okay, so this is a cartoon of the time period of the Munich Agreement of 1938. Now let's fast forward and take a look at a modern day cartoon. So this is a modern day cartoon. This will be your third prompt. In this one, you can see the cartoonist here, Ramirez, is a modern day cartoonist, and I want you to talk about who we think this is, what the whole point, and then this press conference, and notice how things are different, and what do you think this is in regards to. And let's get some in-depth analysis on that one. So, 3 different analysis prompts after you've learned about appeasement, the rise of Germany and German aggression, and so we'll start class and have a conversation about these 3. All right, thank you.